So I'd like to introduce to you the founders, four of the authors of the Constitution. Today is the 231st anniversary of the day that after the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, the people who had hung in there throughout the convention, most of them signed it and sent it off to the states for ratification. And so when I was thinking about things to do for Constitution Day, you know, you hear people say, oh, what was the intent of the framers? We hear that a lot in our politics. So I thought, well, let's ask them. And so I did some conjuring, and we have four of the delegates here. So I'd like to introduce to you Alexander Hamilton. Come on up, gentlemen. James Madison, Charles Pinckney, and Benjamin Franklin. So, Constitution Day was started in 2005 after then living West Virginia Senator Robert Byrd saw a survey that showed how little Americans knew about the Constitution and the form of government it created. This year, just released a couple of days ago, the Annenberg Constitution Day survey, this shows how many people knew that there were three branches of government. So as you can see, about a third of the population knew all three. But you can see those other numbers are not so promising. Now, last year, they focused their questions on First Amendment rights. And this is the year of First Amendment free speech. So when they asked people, okay, so what rights are in the Constitution, 48% could recognize that freedom of speech was protected by the First Amendment, but the other number is not so good. So, why does this matter if we know? Well, ignorance about government matters because it prevents democratic government from working. Government can't properly represent you if the people don't understand the government or don't know what it's about. It also allows the elites to manipulate the system, and it forces politicians to appeal to people, to make their appeals for election or re-election to people who don't understand the system. And that leads to all those really extra annoying ads that we see. Okay, so 1787, Philadelphia Constitutional Convention. So Charles Pinckney is right there in the picture. He was the delegate from South Carolina. Benjamin Franklin, pictured there, one of the delegates from Pennsylvania. Alexander Hamilton, one of the delegates from New York. James Madison, who was one of the delegates from Virginia. And are you guys sitting in your right order? Yes, you are. Okay. Well, before I ask the first question, I thought some founding fathers' humor might be in order. You can Google anything, I swear to God. So it's 1787, and they're in Philadelphia, and a bunch of them are sitting around the table working on the Constitution, and it was a really hot summer. It had been a long day, and one of the founders says, "Whew, it's getting really warm in here, isn't it?" And another founder replied to him, "It sure is. Shall I open the window?" And the first founder says, "No, that's all right. I'll just take up my jackets and roll up my sleeves." To which the other founder replied, "Wow, that's a really good idea. Why don't we include that in the Constitution?" And the first founder responded, "What, the right to roll up our sleeves and go to work?" He says, "Yeah, but that doesn't sound quite right. It's not smooth enough. How about everyone shall have the right to bear arms?" Thank you. So, I will.
It's better than arming bears.
Yeah, well. So I want to ask you, first of all, the First Amendment, it's called the First Amendment because it wasn't in the original Constitution. The amendments were the afterthoughts. And in fact, all of the first 10 amendments, or what we know as the Bill of Rights, weren't added to the Constitution until 2 years later. So before we talk about freedom of speech, I mean, it wasn't in the Constitution originally. Why was there not a list of rights included in the original Constitution?
I want to see if I can you hear me? Yeah, okay. I was the one who more or less was given credit or lack of credit for putting together the amendments. And by the way, the order was not any particular order either. It's not like we sat down and said, let's make the First Amendment be the most important or something like that. But when we were putting together the Constitution, we were concerned about forming a stronger central government. We were not concerned with delegating or enumerating the rights of the people. Those we felt we more took for granted because we were afraid by enumerating them we might leave one out, and then a government that sought to be tyrannical might later, take that away from people and not allow them to practice it. So myself and my colleague, Mr. Hamilton in particular, didn't really see the point of having a Bill of Rights to begin with, philosophically.
If I might add to that, I thought the idea to be dangerous.
Dangerous? What do you mean?
Dangerous, because if you start to enumerate specific rights, then all else could be expropriated. But there were a variety of provisions within the Constitution that did contain references to rights. For instance, habeas corpus, one of the most ancient rights in the English-speaking world, is there in the original text of the Constitution. I thought it more appropriate, if we are to discuss rights, that it should be enumerated by the various states instead of the federal government. So there are a variety of very good reasons why I thought it was dangerous to start limiting rights to that which we amended. It was far better left to the individual states.
And just along those lines, too, to emphasize, our purpose in meeting in Philadelphia in 1787 was to work out a better blueprint for government. And that was our primary focus and our charge.
If I may, and Mr. Madison, if to add to what you had to say, I believe your position was that no Bill of Rights was better than one that might be ignored.
Yeah. Sorry, yes. There were a variety of problems with that the Bill of Rights, or enumerating rights, could be dangerous, it could be pointless, and if those rights were enumerated and then ignored, they would be seen as a negative aspect of the government. So we thought long and hard about a lot of these things, and one of the things I want to emphasize to everybody, we didn't all agree with each other. That's a point that I think can never be made enough. We had to compromise on a number of issues, always seeking not to compromise on principle, but compromise nonetheless, and that is, I think, a word that's I'm concerned is maybe taking out a meaning of somehow weakness now.
And I think we've covered most of the reasons that it didn't get in. I'm going to leave the last one to Mr. Franklin because a lot of the civil rights that come up to be protected are already included in state constitutions. However, I would also like to mention that on August the 20th, about 1 month before the convention ended, I submitted a proposal of 11 different conditions that should be protected. Now, I will also have to say that freedom of speech was not one of those, but it did include many of the civil rights that did get included in the 10 Amendments, and it was actually able to get no religious test for public office included in the body of the Constitution itself. And with that, I'll turn it over to my distinguished colleague, Dr. Franklin.
You will notice that I've been largely silent during this conversation. That is because I believe that when a man has nothing productive to add to the conversation, he ought not add anything at all. The reality, though, was when the Bill of Rights was under consideration, I had already moved on to my reward. That having been said, I have no problems with the inclusion of the Bill of Rights because I had no illusion about what we were doing in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. We were not there seeking perfection. We were there seeking a workable plan of government, and I freely admitted that the plan that we had adopted did not meet all of my expectations, but then I'm not sure any plan could. So the fact that the Constitution was amended almost immediately troubles me not at all, because it was not a perfect document and was susceptible to change.
I would also like to bring up, there was quite a bit of discussion in the convention over this issue of rights. One of Mr. Madison's colleagues, George Mason, introduced several provisions to be included, as well as and we seconded and reinforced each other's thoughts about that. Mr. Mason was so upset that nothing was included to guaranteeing the protection of civil rights that he actually left the convention without signing the document. At the same time, Eldridge Gary from Massachusetts brought up many provisions as well, trying to get these protections included within the body of the Constitution. So I don't want you to have the impression that there was nothing going on talking about these. Most of it came much later in the discussions before the close of the convention, and the work was done because, as was mentioned earlier, the primary purpose was to develop a workable governmental structure for the country itself.
Thank you. And in case you missed the allusion, when Dr. Franklin said he had gone on to his reward, he had died by the time the Bill of Rights was being written and ratified.
I'm sorry, I thought that was understood. My apologies.
Well, reward, I don't know, you know.
I was dead there.
So the First Amendment that was eventually written and ratified and added says Congress shall make no law regarding an establishment of religion or abridging the free exercise thereof, or of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peacefully to assemble and to petition government for a redress of their grievances. So the part that I want to focus on is Congress will not abridge the right of freedom of press, speech, or the press. What were you thinking of? So was there a particular kind of speech that was most important to you, or was all speech equal?
Excuse me, before we get to answering that question, could I ask Mr. Madison how he became such an ardent supporter of the Bill of Rights after he opposed it during the convention itself, and became known as the father?
Yes, there's a certain irony in the fact that I philosophically opposed the idea of a Bill of Rights and then come down in history as known as the father of the Bill of Rights. I would give credit to my...
Would you prefer we called you the baby daddy of the Bill of Rights? Sorry.
No, especially since Dolly and I had no children of our own. It's the only thing I ever fathered. So the George Mason, who was mentioned, I like to think of as the grandfather of the Bill of Rights because he was most ardent in pushing for it. And it was really a classic example of where philosophically I did not agree with him, but pragmatically, in order to get on board the so-called anti-federalists like Mason, those who oppose the Constitution, this was their major argument. Even though they lost in the ratification conventions at the various states, they did bring this point up, this kept coming up, and I realized that in order to get them on board, the losing faction, if you will, that it would require addressing their concerns so that they felt they had a stake in the government as well. And so from a pragmatic point of view, I was willing to compromise in order to get that more perfect union that we were seeking. All of us were very upset with the final document that we hammered out. But we thought, okay, at least we have something, and as Dr. Franklin pointed out, amendments could adjust the things that we didn't get right or that we left out.
You've talked a couple of times about how there wasn't disagreement. I wonder if you could each tell me one of the things that each of you in particular disagreed with. Mr. Pinckney, what did you not like?
Before I answer that question, I wanted to follow on a question to Jimmy, using the familiar term. Did it not have anything at all to do with the significant population of Baptists in your district that you were trying to run for Congress with?
I don't see how that's relevant at all. I'm not sure why we have to bring up these kind of political concerns. That was after the fact, okay? But yeah, when we moved to put together a Bill of Rights, there was also a practical aspect of it. I don't see that as necessarily wrong.
It's because you kept changing your damn mind, Madison. Every time you stood on principle, then you reversed yourself. Don't you remember that? I started a certain bank in the United States. Don't you remember that? And you opposed it until after I was dead. Then you thought it was a marvelous idea.
In my defense, I've been called a kind of weather vane in terms of I tended to point in the direction against the direction I thought the country was going dangerously in. And so at the time of the Constitution, I was worried about the states. Once the Constitution was put into effect, and I saw how Mr. Hamilton tried to use it to create an energetic executive that he would be behind, I became worried. And I thought that the pendulum was swinging too far the other way. And so if that sounds like someone who's unprincipled, well, I'm sorry. But I believe that I was the one who stood firm while all around me were losing their heads.
Perhaps it would be wise at this point if the voice of wisdom spoke. Gentlemen, rather than engaging in these petty disagreements that characterized our debates in Philadelphia in 1787, may I remind you of something I said in my concluding remarks? And that is, rather than airing those opinions of error, perhaps it's in our best interest to sacrifice those opinions to the public good.
So tell me something you didn't like about the Constitution.
Well, I mean, just,
One thing.
To further enlighten the rest of the audience, even though the Constitution was ratified by 11 different states, 5 included a provision that there would recommended amendments and a convention to amend the Constitution, so to include a Bill of Rights. So in my opinion, in the original body of the Constitution, in the various articles, I think there are 2 things that were not included that should have been included. And one was the right of jury trial for civil offenses. The other one was quartering of troops in private residences. And most importantly, this is 3, I can't count, was freedom of the press. So, and if you look in the body of the Constitution, there is no provision for freedom of the press.
Dr. Franklin, what provision did you quarrel with?
I make no bones about the fact that as one of the founders of a Philadelphia Manumission Society, it troubled me deeply that the issue of slavery was not addressed and resolved by the convention.
Mr. Hamilton?
Article 9, Section 9, Article 1, the slavery provision was absolutely, I was in agreement with Dr. Franklin on this matter. I thought it was high time that we end such an odious practice in the United States, and I regret deeply putting my name to an agreement that allowed the importation of African slaves for another 20 years, and then to my great disappointment in seeing the subsequent generations that it took so long for elimination of the institution altogether.
And Mr. Madison, what part of the Constitution did you, as we know it today, did you object to?
Well, seeing as I'm also known as the father of the Constitution, I have to take some pride in my progeny. On the other hand, the Virginia plan that I first proposed would have given much more power to the large states, and I felt that the states generally retained too much power under the Constitution as it was framed. To the point about slavery, let me point out that philosophically, I was against slavery. Pragmatically, I felt that as great as the evil was, no union would be worse. If we have no union, the southern states that had slavery would still have slavery. But with a union, perhaps there was an opportunity to do something along the lines of manumission and even emancipation that Dr. Franklin and Mr. Hamilton talked about. Remember, they're from Pennsylvania and New York. Very few slaves. Those were societies with slaves, but not slave societies like Virginia. And so it was a very hard sell. And as much as later generations will look on us as not accomplishing that, that was not our task in Philadelphia. Our task was to create a union that could be maintained and be perpetual. And trying to solve the issue of slavery before that would have meant no union, in my opinion.
And I would second what Mr. Madison had to say. Trying to convince the southern states to sign a union that abolished slavery at that time, we would not have had a United States of America. We'd had two different sectional bodies.
So, Mr. Pinckney, you objected to not having a provision for freedom of the press in the original Constitution. Why did you find that to be important?
And I found that to be important because there needed to be a free and open discourse about matters that pertain to the government of the United States and the operations, and it needed to be some transparency about what was taking place and arguments about both the pros and the cons of what was taking place.
But wasn't the press pretty lively at the time?
The press was lively, but the other thing that really concerned not only I, but also the other founders was the possibility, and believe it or not, the encroachment of the powers of Congress to do away with the freedom of the press. Most of the founders were much more concerned about Congress expanding the powers that it had been granted and becoming overbearing and beginning to restrict most of the freedoms that had been guaranteed within the Constitution and later on within the first 10 amendments.
We keep using the word founder. I'm not entirely sure we had a sense of ourselves as founders. Obviously, in order to put together a plan of government, it's advantageous to call upon the wisdom of many individuals. That is what we attempted in Philadelphia in 1787, was to call upon the wisdom of many different individuals. And of course, we were smart enough to realize that along with that wisdom, came their passions and their prejudices and their errors of opinion. So it was a lively and ultimately productive discourse, but I'm not sure that that we had any illusions about what we were doing and its difficulty. I perceive that since we've been gone, you all look back upon what we did with a good deal of satisfaction, perhaps. But also, I think you place in us an aura that we never would have claimed for ourselves.
Just to follow up, we were totally shocked to see that the document is still in effect. We hope that it might last a generation. And, could we shackle future generations to our ideas? So it's a very surprising thing to know that it succeeded as well as it has, as long as it has.
So by 1791, when the Bill of Rights was ratified, there was this protection that Congress shouldn't abridge freedom of speech or the press. And yet, in 1798, Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, it was a series of laws that did suppress free speech. So at that time, there were probably still members in Congress that had been a part of the Congress that voted to propose the First Amendment. What up with that?
I think you have to understand the Alien Sedition Act occurred within a context, and the context was the rise of revolutionary France at the time, which had become quite violent, and which was posing a direct threat to the United States. After the XYZ affair, as we called it, there was an attempt by French delegates to intervene in American public life, to have this effect upon our politics, and President Adams, largely urged by his wife, decided that there were limits to this discourse, and these resulted in the aforementioned Alien Sedition Acts, and some of it involved censorship of the press, particularly in those instances in which it was bringing disrepute to the government. We saw that as an important act. Now, subsequently, I think Mr. Adams, after my passing on to my reward, blamed me. I certainly knew that it was actually his idea, but this was something that occurred within a context of international interference in our republic, and I don't think we should ignore that.
Were there objections to the Alien Sedition Acts at the time based on the First Amendment?
I made one of the objections. I was philosophically opposed, but I was pragmatic on something. Now, on this issue, I wrote what was known as the Virginia Resolutions, seeking to interpose against a law which I viewed as unconstitutional. And if we keep in mind at this time there was no judicial review yet, so who got to determine what was unconstitutional was very much up in the air. And in this case, I believe that the state had the power to rule against a law and not enforce a law, or to interpose against a law that it found to be unconstitutional, because of going against these very rights that you're talking about.
But my dear Mr. Madison, doesn't that run directly counter to your initial proposal in the convention to give the federal government the right to overturn state law? I mean, it was you who claimed that states were too powerful, and now you're telling us that in this instance, they should have exercised
right,
power.
Exactly. 11 years later, the pendulum had swung too much in the other direction, I felt. And so, weather vane that I was pointing to warn Americans of the new danger that was posed by an overweening federal republic. The other point that I wanted to make is that it was Jefferson wrote the Kentucky resolutions against the Alien Sedition Acts. And in doing so, we were seen as almost traitorous because we were opposing the administration in power. And the administration in power saw itself as the government. So to oppose that administration was seen by Federalists, people like Mr. Hamilton, as somehow bordering on treason on our part. We saw ourselves as simply a loyal opposition who was trying to bring the country back to a kind of sane way of thinking.
Speaking of the press, sometimes we're in a period at the moment where sometimes people accuse the press of being biased and unfair to some people. What was the tone like amongst reporters? Were they always very respectful, or was there ever any bias? What did you guys feel? What was your sense of reporters and the press?
That was the nature of the press.
What?
The press reported bias exactly. I mean, newspapers were party organs. Newspapers were expressors of the various opinions of partisans in politics.
They weren't objective?
No. The way
They were
the way-
vicious.
The way
Vicious.
The way objectivity occurred was to make certain that there were multiple voices that would be allowed to speak, and from that multiplicity of voices, then one would be able to determine for oneself what was worth adhering to and what not.
Mr.
what-
Hamilton, you seem to have hit a nerve.
Absolutely not. This was calumnies. Calumnies directed primarily against myself. Now, I do believe that I had some instrument in founding the New York Post, and therefore was interested in this subject. But the variety of scurrilous and utterly untrue things that were written about me in the Republican press, primarily by your grandson, Dr. Franklin, it was unconscionable that
Are you
people would
calling
write
it
that.
fake news?
There was no sense of reality. This was, if there were to be an analogy to contemporaneous, this is entirely opinion pieces. Typically speaking, what a newspaper editor would do was get other newspaper editors' papers and use what was available and with which he or she agreed most commonly, and then simply not pass on the rest of it. And so it was always opinion. It was always opinion. The idea of reporters didn't exist yet. The idea of an objective press did not exist yet. What did exist was partisan political papers that were exclusively directed at the other side, and in particular myself.
In fairness, Alexander, we all came under the direct and often vicious lamentations of the press. I don't know that it necessarily directed at you alone.
What I will admit, though, that as one of the founders of the opposition party to Mr. Hamilton's party, this is after we had worked together to get the Constitution through. But I became alarmed at some of the proposals and policies that he followed as Secretary of the Treasury. So working with my good friend Thomas Jefferson, we sought to balance the abuse of power that we saw going on by Mr. Hamilton with a press that, as my friend Jefferson said, basically sought to tear him apart. And we felt that was in the interests of the Republic, because we feared that he was taking his legitimate power too far, which of course is tyranny. It's taking power that is given to someone and then who abuses it. And we felt that Mr. Hamilton was abusing his power.
With all due respect, Mr. Madison, because I occupied a lofty position in those days, I remember that you and Mr. Jefferson imported one James Freneau from Italy, placed him on the payroll of the State Department, and made him the editor of a newspaper that published what you wanted them to publish.
Much of which was simply untrue.
I think what you can see is that we didn't have a consensus once we laid down the blueprint for the government and even the Bill of Rights. Interpreting those things, we never agreed on. And I think you can maybe take some hope in your own time to realize that we've been through this before. We've been through these kind of disagreements before. We've got past them, sometimes far more vicious than anything since. And, you know, that, again, to get away from this notion that we were all just of one mind, and somehow we've lost that over the 200 and some years since. No, we were never of one mind, and the Constitution itself sets out a framework in which we can argue, and that's what we do. And political parties were created to promote one side of that argument. Usually it was a side that I thought was right, that I sided with Mr. Jefferson against my old friend and ally, Mr. Hamilton.
Yeah, and I don't want you to think that this, divisive nature of the argument was just taking place up in the Northeast and where the center of government was. I retreated back to South Carolina, and I was subjected to the same partisan vitriol that these gentlemen up here were. I ran as governor 4 times in the state of South Carolina, and each time the elite landed gentry of the low country down in the Charleston area disparaged me because I was from that class, but at the same time was looking to the high country, the farmers and yeomen inland, for my political support. So, this partisanship in terms of the press was going on throughout all of the states themselves, and not just in the national press itself.
It is in this healthy disagreement, this active public debate, that wisdom is born. And I think that perhaps succeeding generations have come to the conclusion that somehow we were wise by definition. That is not the case. We learned as we aged, we learned with experience, we drew wisdom upon wisdom, and so long as the environment was open to the expression of competing viewpoints, it was possible for us to gain that wisdom. So lest you think that these public debates, these debates in which we engaged, were somehow pointless, fruitless, had no value, nothing is further from the truth. It is by so doing that we gain wisdom, and it's why even as a 16-year-old boy writing under the pseudonym of Silence Dogood, I indicated that the only restrictions on the right of free speech should be that people not hurt or control the rights of others. Apart from that, speech and expression should be largely open and free, and exchanges should occur without bound.
I want to get some questions from the audience pretty quick here, but I do have one more question. Sometimes people ask about the pardon power. The Constitution gives the power to the president to pardon people of federal crimes. And was that a controversial provision when you were talking about it?
Oh, very much so. There was a sense among most of us that there had to be some sort of power of pardon. There was, I think, a fair degree of consensus, but the question was over which crimes and who would be granted the pardons. I understood both sides. One group said that either one body of Congress or possibly both bodies of Congress would have to approve pardons. Others said that it lie with the chief magistrate, that is the president. I saw both sides, particularly when it came to one particular crime, and that is treason. And treason was the one crime that I saw particularly the need to be very careful in how this grant of pardon would be made. At the same time, I recognized that it ought to be in the power of the chief executive to make pardons and make it on his own power. The reason being that, particularly during Shays' Rebellion, but also the Whiskey Rebellion in this part of the country, a well-timed offer of pardon to critical leaders within a rebellion could, in fact, end the rebellion with very little bloodshed if timely offered. And unfortunately, Congress and Senate are not timely bodies. The chief executive is, and that is why I thought it resides in the president.
I would like to, do you guys have some questions? What have you always wanted to ask the founders?
This is a question that Mr. Madison about Mr. Hamilton. You said that you opposed his banking system that he was coming up with. Did you think he was creating a conspiracy to take all the money?
Well, once the government went into place, Mr. Hamilton was very aggressive in promoting certain policies, especially financial policies. I became very concerned about this, and specifically, one of the things that he did was he wanted Congress to authorize a Bank of the United States. There's nothing in the Constitution that specifically talks about a Bank of the United States. And myself and my friend, there's nothing specific in there. And working with my friend, Mr. Jefferson, this was the first real policy of Mr. Hamilton that we used to form an opposition party to him. Because what we saw is a kind of usurpation of power, the threat of that. And this is very real because this is, we were a new republic in a world full of monarchies. And this is the kind of policy that you would see in a monarchy, we feared.
To respond, my favorite article.
We kept them on separate sides of the room. I don't know how you're going to control them.
Section 8 of Article 1, last paragraph, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for the carrying into execution of the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or any department or officer thereof. There is nothing in the Constitution about lighthouses, my good Hamilton, but would you leave the sailors of America to the tender mercies of the deep main? I think not. Therefore, it is absolutely necessary and proper to establish lighthouses and revenue cutters. It's not mentioned in there either. And therefore, a bank makes sense. If you simply studied the Bank of England and the progress that they made in industrializing that country, it is eminently worth emulating in this country as well. Now, I saw absolutely no reason why it's not prohibited by the Constitution. We should have a bank, and it helped the American finance immensely during the administration of the Federalists. The Republicans, on the other hand, abolished the bank, then found it to be useful, and then abolished it again. This inconstancy in the opposition was most unseemly.
But before you respond, let me just, sort of chime in here and say the clause that Mr. Hamilton just quoted, necessary and proper, was really the straw man that was available for Congress to expand its powers howsoever it wanted. And that's what most of the people, that the citizenry that were opposed to a stronger federal government looked to as the primary concern.
Yes, our concerns were also in a broad philosophical range of much as we were opposed in religion, or we favored, I should say, a separation of church and state. In finances, we favored a separation of bank and state. So we worried about the growth of undue power in the hands of those who would run that government and use that instrument to their benefit.
That was a good question.
I have a question for Mr. Hamilton. If I'm correct, you did serve in the Army under General Washington, And how did like serving in the Army influence you in the Constitutional Congress?
Oh, a very good question. Yes, I did have the great honor of serving under General Washington. I was part of his family, that is the staff officers. I had also previously served in New York Artillery and was particularly fortunate to command a battalion during the assault on one of the redoubts at Yorktown. I must say, one of the things that struck me about the military staff life was the importance of organization. Knowing where your papers are, keeping copies, knowing how to write concisely and directly and succinctly were all skills that were necessary. In the midst of battle, you can't have a long exegesis. You need to get it down and get it right. A second thing that was very important about my military experience is the importance of foreign languages. I was fortunate. My mother was French Huguenot. And she taught me French. And my capacity in that language was essential in working with officers of the French Army who came to assist us during the Revolutionary War. And so I recommend it highly to anyone that foreign languages are very important.
I didn't serve, so I can't answer.
Merci, Mr. Hamilton.
So, Mr. Madison, you brought up how you were shocked that the Constitution lasted a generation. Do you and the other founding fathers believe that the Constitution should be examined every generation or so and possibly changed?
One of those things that I lived till 1836, so I was able to see it last more than a generation. In making it, though, we didn't know if it would work to begin with. I mean, we certainly put our hopes and trust in it, but we didn't know if succeeding generations would accept it. You know, and I think the hope or the in terms of its perpetuity, the amending process gives away, much like general science does. If a proposition is wrong, you can correct it, okay? And in the same way, the amending process, which is not easy to do, but can be done, this is another means to allowing future generations to make adjustments without having to scrap it entirely. And I think that's very important because it's always easy to know what's wrong with the government that you have. It's never really clear that just getting rid of it will be enough. You have to replace it with something better. The amending process is a kind of check and balance on that, perhaps.
Let me follow up. I mean, first of all, you have to understand that, as Mr. Madison said, this was essentially an experiment. We just run a 10-year experiment on the Articles of Confederation, and it come to the conclusion they weren't working very well. So we needed to change what we had in place and look for something better to govern the United States of America as it exists. And secondly, this had never been done before. I mean, these forms of government that we were coming up with, there was no model out there to just, plug things into and go from. This was all originated from a synthesis of lots of political philosophy and political science that existed at the time. So the fact that, it lasted as long as it has, we're really proud of that, but the probability that it would have lasted this long was probably not in our favor.
We all agreed that a general government was in the best interests of the country. The country needed a general government that could do what needed to be done, that possessed the power necessary to the task. We also understood that a general government, if administered properly, would be a blessing to the people. Any general government administered poorly would become a tyranny to the people. So I think from my vantage point, the fact that it has lasted as long as it has is a credit to succeeding generations who, by and large, administered that general government wisely.
One real obvious point is the beginning words of the document, "We the people." I think that both makes the point of the perpetual nature, or at least the continuing nature of this document, but also its ability to adjust. Because in 1787, when we talked about "we the people," we didn't mean what you mean by "we the people." And so the framework that we set up was flexible enough to adjust to the notion in subsequent years of including more and more non-propertied white men, slaves, women, others, into this collective of the people.
Hello, my question is the writing of the Constitution was to limit, you guys believe that Congress, the legislative branch, was going to be the most powerful. That's why you had so many checks and balances for it. Did you guys just not expect how powerful the executive branch would become over time and as we see today? And therefore, what should we do now to limit the power of the president, and how should we do that?
Well, I must say I was always a very big fan of Article 2, the executive, and the ability to get things done. And one of the key elements in my mind was that Congress, by its nature in our days, did not sit all year. In fact, it sat for only brief periods of time and had a difficult time making up its mind. And thus, the day-to-day affairs of government devolved quite naturally upon the chief magistrate, and that is the president. And I thought that it was natural. We had departments that had to take care of, for instance, the revenues. Most of the revenues of America at that time went through the Treasury Department in the form of tariffs. But other functions were out there. Mr. Jefferson, during my time, was Secretary of State, and other positions had to be fulfilled. The foreign policy of America doesn't end during the legislative term, nor does the tax collection end at the end of a legislative term. So I thought it was entirely appropriate that the executive should have considerable power. Indeed, I had proposed a much more expansive executive in my plan for the Constitution, but unfortunately after 6 hours of what I thought was rather persuasive speaking, no one adopted it.
Perhaps because your proposal sounded too much like England in terms of energetic executive indeed. Energizer Bunny.
Have you been watching TV?
Yeah, they allow us when we come back to watch TV a little and catch up on things. But yes, Mr. Hamilton was always more interested in an executive that had more power. One of the things that I think would have struck all of us as a little unusual or surprising is the third branch that you never mentioned, the courts, especially the Supreme Court. At our time, as I mentioned earlier, there was no consensus that the Supreme Court was the only court that could rule on the constitutionality of something. The very Virginia resolves and the Kentucky resolutions that Mr. Jefferson put forth questioned that. And as I said, so the states could rule. Later, Andrew Jackson claimed he could rule on what was constitutional and what was not. And he felt he had the right to ignore decisions made by the Supreme Court when they didn't go along with him. So what I think we, again, put into place a framework that allowed for the times to adapt, if the country was going to go on. And I think all of us would be greatly surprised by some of the directions the country has gone in.
there's a paradox at the heart of the presidency. In the first place, I think, regardless of his dismissive attitude, Mr. Madison would agree that given our experience, we understood the necessity of an energetic executive. Without energy in the executive, effective government cannot occur. I think Mr. Hamilton made that point rather nicely. But on the other hand, to a man, we were fearful of the concentration of power and the degree to which that power could be abused and arbitrarily exercised. We were conscious of the paradox at the heart of the executive, at the executive branch. But we were confident, I think to a man, that the first executive would be General Washington. And General Washington had demonstrated to us rather convincingly over the course of his career that he cared not one whit for power. And so our belief, our firm belief was that General Washington would set the precedent necessary in order to turn the executive office into the office we envisioned, even in the midst of the paradox at its center.
Just to follow up on what Dr. Franklin said, just an example of this. Napoleon, when it was reported to have said that he thought George Washington giving up power was the greatest act of an individual he had ever heard of in history. It's something Napoleon himself couldn't do, as he said on his deathbed. They wanted me to be another Washington. This is highly unusual at any time in history. And I think Washington, while he may not have been an intellect on the order of a Thomas Jefferson or an Alexander Hamilton, he set precedents for the executive that assured all of us a lot more about our concerns about the potential for tyranny, because he showed the road that could be walked by someone who had that kind of power and yet chose not to use it.
And just to follow up, as I mentioned earlier, the overwhelming majority of the delegates were much more concerned about Congress expanding their power and becoming the most powerful one. And if you structurally, if you look at Article 1 and Article 2, the powers given to Congress, the legislative branch, there are 13 enumerated powers within Article 1 for the legislative branch, to include the necessary and proper clause, which essentially allows you to do whatever you think you want to do. And in Article 2, the powers of the executive, there are only 3. So Congress was much more to be wary of than the executive themselves. Well, and so how do we get to the point that we contemporarily at? Congress deferred a lot of those powers that they were granted and delegated a lot of those powers they were granted to the executive branch.
We're going to have one more question. Or not. So something I want to say at the end that I don't say at the beginning. First, I'm going to introduce the alter egos of these gentlemen, but I do want to say they have done the best that they can to represent faithfully the characters which they're portraying. And they may not agree with the positions of and that's really important to them, that you know that they were just channeling to the best of their ability based on their studies. But I have to thank these guys. They faithfully put these very warm costumes on, and I really appreciate their work. So, as Charles Pinckney, we have Dr. Mac Fidner. As Dr. Benjamin Franklin, we have Dr. David Chambers.
I should point out at this point that the generation wasn't clothed so much as upholstered.
Mr. Alexander Hamilton is Dr. Stephen Jackson. And
Who has a musical name now?
yes, he has a musical now. And Mr. James Madison is Dr. Joe Menard.
I would like to say that I am not a racist, and I am not a sexist, I am not a homophobe, but I play one on TV. Thank you.
So, thank you so much. There's constitutions back there. Please take one, and some other literature, and thank you very much.